Okay, thanks everybody. Welcome to another Wednesday webinar. And today is Wednesday, September 28th, 2022. Happens to be 2 days before my son's birthday, 3 days before my grandson AJ's birthday, and 3 days before my birthday. Our family likes to clump birthdays together. Again, thanks everybody for joining me, and a few announcements. There will be no webinar on Friday, and so I will see you next Wednesday. And we want to invite everybody to the Weston Price Foundation conference on, I believe, October 21st through the 23rd. That's in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I will be there, and the whole team from Dr. Cowan's Garden and Dr. Tom Cowan will be there manning the booths and helping meet everybody and answer questions. It's a great place to meet very like-minded people and to network and to learn new things. A lot of my friends will be speaking there. I believe Eileen McCusick and Andy Kaufman and Kelly Brogan and Sally Fallon and a whole bunch of other people. So please come. And if you do, please say hello and introduce yourself if we don't already know each other. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting new friends there. I think that's all the announcements I had for today. So today I was going to talk about heart attacks. I actually did this on Wednesday, but it didn't record last week. So hopefully everything is fine today. Before I do that, of course, I'm sort of stuck on virology a little bit. But I wanted to play a brief clip because it's so much the crux of the issue. And what I mean by that is the crux of the issue is, why is there not a single published paper in the history of virology or medicine or science showing the direct finding of any pathogenic virus, HIV, Ebola, polio, SARS-CoV-2, monkeypox, chickenpox, any other so-called pathogenic virus directly in the fluids of any sick plant, animal, or human being? Not once. And when people hear that, they sort of can't believe it. And so I want to play a little clip that essentially reminds you that this is in fact true and acknowledged by essentially now we have over 200 institutions, CDC, NIH, et cetera, all virologists and all of the members of the so-called freedom community who are still pushing viruses. So the only thing I would say is it's a little bit out of context, because when they refer to ultracentrifugation, that of course is the only way you could find the virus directly from a biological sample. So that's what Dr. Malone is referring to in this brief clip. Let me do that again.
But these are classic virology isolation methods and techniques. There's nothing idiosyncratic here. And to isolate a virus by density gradient, you would require somebody to be incredibly virulent, just shedding very, very large amounts of virus. And you would have to have a body fluid that has that large amount of virus. And even then, I don't think it'd be possible.
Okay, and you could see Dr. Cole nodding in the background with the kind of a grin on his face. So obviously he agrees with what Dr. Malone was saying. So let's think about this. They're saying, acknowledging, number one, you cannot find any virus that's called SARS-CoV-2 in any sputum of any sick person. Everybody agrees with that. So why not? Well, the answer is there's not enough virus to see. And they all agree with that, apparently. Even though the lung culture is supposedly the perfect culture medium for this particular virus. And even though in the same breath they tell us the lungs are teeming with viruses, that's how they kill you. These viruses infect millions of cells, and they produce billions of copies of themselves. And when they burst out of the cell, they kill the cell, and then apparently there's an immune response to these millions or billions of viruses. So it's a mechanical killing of the cell by these untold number of viruses. That's how the viral theory explains how disease is caused by viruses. And then in the next breath, and by the way, you can't find it because there's not enough to see. And by the way we find it is we take this unpurified stuff that doesn't have enough to see, and we put it into a little test tube or a little petri dish of monkey kidney cells, which is not the natural host. And then we watch it by some miracle, it grows and grows and grows until then, by again, a miracle, there is enough to see. It, of course, can't grow and grow and grow until there's enough to see in your lungs, even though that's the natural habitat of this supposed virus. But if you put it in an abnormal habitat in a test tube, then it will grow and you'll be able to see it. And this is pure, unmitigated nonsense. And I'm hoping that people will ask and even record, and if you want to, you could send it to me in a very friendly way. Ask anybody, any doctor, any freedom activist who believes in viruses, why can't you find them in the lungs? Why can't you find it in the nervous system directly? And then record it and send it to me, and let's see what they say. The next thing, which I touched on, and I'm not sure if this got recorded, but is the way we do science is not how any of us, particularly me, would do it. Again, what I mentioned and the heart attack story will be yet another example of this. If somebody has a theory, the theory viruses cause disease, here's how we find them. We do these cell cultures and these alignment procedures and look at an electron microscope. I get a very clear, so I'm the head of this project. I get a very clear statement. Here's how we do it. And then I collect engineers and people who work in isolating chemicals, chemical analysts and plumbers and everybody else, and get them to say, do you have any problem with how they're doing this? Because clearly they do. Once I gathered that, I would go back and say, well, you didn't do this. You didn't do this. You didn't do every possible control experiment. You didn't look for the virus in the snot. You didn't try to expose the cell culture to with and without antibiotics, different concentrations of antibiotics, to the snot of a healthy person, snot of somebody with lung cancer. You should be doing every possible control because your job, your moral responsibility is to prove yourself wrong. And rather than that, they fight every step of the way. They hide the so-called mock experiments as if they're controls. They hide it every step of the way. They bully people. They don't make the steps public. They don't explain it. Once I got the results, I would have another public forum, invite everybody to comment on this, and see if we can, at the end of the day, prove that there is something to this theory or not. Now, let's look at this, that way of doing things from the lens of what causes heart attacks, or apply it to the problem of what causes heart attacks. So here, probably some of you have heard this, but here again is my story of how I came to this. So everybody, of course, knows that the reason you have heart attacks, everybody seems to agree, from the man walking down the street to the head of cardiology at Johns Hopkins, the story goes, we have a heart, it's a muscle, it's got 4 different chambers. It has a blood supply, which is 3 major coronary arteries. All of the blood goes through those 3 major vessels. They go to different parts of the heart. And if one of those major vessels gets blocked with plaque, the blood can't get through the blockage, and the part downstream past the blockage dies because it can't get enough food and oxygen. So you get an ischemia, lack of oxygenation, essentially, death of the tissue, because there's no blood flow, because there's a blockage in that artery leading to that part of the heart. Everybody from 6th grade up knows that's why there's heart attacks. Now, I went to medical school and internship. I never once even heard the explanation of how we came to know that that was true. Not only didn't I hear an explanation of how we came to know that was true, I didn't even know that that explanation actually was a theory called the thrombogenic theory, because the blockages are called a thrombus. And so the thrombogenic theory says the reason for heart attacks is you get a thrombus or clot in one of the arteries or one or more of the arteries leading to different parts of the heart. The blood can't get through, and then you can't get enough food and oxygen, like I said, and then it dies. When the food and oxygen deficit is small, you just have chest pain, otherwise known as angina, especially if you exert yourself. So you put more of a load on the muscle, and then the oxygen supply isn't enough. And so then that causes pain. And if it's really bad and comes even when you're resting, that's called unstable angina. And then if it gets so bad and there's very little blood flow, and usually you put some extra load on your heart, then the oxygen deficit is so big that you get an ischemic injury or actual cell death or cell necrosis, meaning that myocardial tissue, the heart cells tissue, dies. So that's very clear, and that's called the thrombogenic theory. We all learned that. It's sort of like mother's milk and apple pie and American exceptionalism. We all think that that's true. We don't necessarily know where those came from, but it must be true because everybody believes it. Or the consensus of cardiologists, I hear that a lot, is that that's how it happens. So I finish my internship, and I start my private, sort of holistic practice. And I also need to make money. So I ended up getting a job and getting trained as an ER doctor. And so I end up seeing, scores, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people with chest pain, some of whom were having heart attacks, some of whom thought they were having heart attacks. But my job was to evaluate them and see which of them were having heart attacks and then refer them to the cardiologists. And so I became used to dealing with heart patients. And like always, I started asking myself some questions and didn't say much about it at the time. So here's sort of how that went. I said to myself, okay, if all the blood goes through these three major vessels, all the blood to the heart, and one of them gets blocked with plaque, that's what causes the heart attack. So the question I asked myself, is the blood everywhere in the body the same? In other words, there must be something in the blood which is precipitating or settling or somehow doing something to the arteries so that this blockage happens. So again, is the blood that goes through the coronary arteries the same as the blood that goes through, say, the splenic artery, or that's the artery to the spleen, hepatic artery to the liver, femoral artery to your leg, foot artery, brain artery, liver, kidneys, all the rest of the arteries? And obviously the answer is yes. Nobody, as far as I know, thinks that you have a special blood that only goes through your coronary arteries that's different than the blood going through the spleen artery. Okay, next. Are these coronary arteries made of the same material and essentially anatomically and histologically identical to the artery to the spleen and liver and foot and brain and pancreas and all the rest? And again, as far as I know, there is no theory that says that the arteries in the coronary arteries, the heart arteries, are somehow different than all the rest of the arteries in the body. In other words, arteries are arteries, the blood is the blood, and so there's no difference in the blood and arteries in the heart versus the artery and blood to the spleen. If that's the case, and there's something in the blood that's causing this precipitation of plaque, it obviously must happen to every artery in the body. And so that turns out to be true. So you get plaque in your renal artery and hepatic artery and splenic artery. As time went on, medicine and science tried to investigate which part of the blood was causing this plaque. Originally, they said cholesterol, and then they said, no, it's a certain type of lipoprotein called LDL. And then they said, no, it's not just all the LDL, it's LP little a, or it's not just LP little a, it's the relation of LDL to HDL or LP little a to HDL. So they get more and more specific about which component it is in the blood, but never do they give up the idea that it must be something in the blood, something which, as I say, is going through the splenic artery as well. The next step in this was people said, well, okay, it may not be something in the blood, it's an inflammatory process also in the blood, I would presume. And it's this chronic inflammation, maybe an infection or maybe something else. And so it's not just the cholesterol or the LDL or the low HDL or the LP little a. It's a chronic inflammatory process, but again, in all the arteries of the body: coronary artery, spleen artery, liver artery. So then I said, well, if that's true, and this is an artery problem, I'm going to find out if anybody has a spleen attack or a liver attack or a foot attack or a kidney attack. So over the years, it's starting in the ER and then my private patients, and then every lecture I gave on the heart for the last 20 some years, I asked everybody in the audience, anybody know of anybody with a heart attack? Personally, or family member or friend, or Dick Cheney or Bill Clinton or any of these people, and 100% of the people raised their hand because everybody knows somebody who had a heart attack. And a lot of people have it themselves. And then I would say, how many people know somebody or had personal experience or know of a celebrity or somebody they heard of who had a spleen attack? And maybe we're talking 50 to 100,000 people I've asked, And I'm sure you can guess the number of people who raised their hand and said yes was exactly 0. Nobody has ever seen or heard of or knows anybody who had a liver attack or a spleen attack or any other kind of attack besides a heart attack or a brain attack, otherwise known as a stroke. So what's the problem? Why don't these other organs have attacks? They obviously have blockages too. So what's the difference? So that was my first question in this theory. The second question, and this came more after I wrote the heart book, Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, where, by the way, many of these references that I'm going to not show you but allude to, you can find all of them in that book. I had, I don't know how many people, let's say 500 to 1,000, with a very similar story over the years. So usually a middle-aged 50 to 60-year-old male, and he's not in the greatest shape, but not so bad. And then he goes hiking with his wife or friend, and he has a little bit of chest pain, not so bad, but enough to that he mentions it, whereas he doesn't usually mention anything like that. Tells his wife insists that he go to the cardiologist. Cardiologist says, oh, we need to look into this. So does some exam and does a blood test, does a stress echo, eventually does an angiogram, a catheterization, and then says, okay, we need to talk. And then they almost always wag their finger at them like this. And they say, you have a 95% blockage. And if you block any more than that, you're going to die of a heart attack. And so obviously they don't want to die of a heart attack, so they get their blockage fixed. I started thinking about that, and I came to this kind of thought process. If all of the blood to your heart is going through these 3 major arteries, and one of them is blocked 90 to 95%, then that means to a major area of your heart, you have somewhere around 5 to 10% of your normal blood flow. And then we're told that if it blocks, say, from 5% down to a 97 or 98% blockage, meaning now you only have 2 to 3% blood flow, that's what's going to kill you. That drop from 6% down to 2%. That's going to make the difference. That's going to allow you to go from pretty functional with occasional twingy feelings of being not quite right to full-blown heart attack where it may kill you. And I ended up thinking that simply is not possible. In fact, 5 to 10% blood flow is essentially no blood flow. And so a difference between 5 or 6 or 7% and 2 to 3% is no difference at all, and that can't possibly be the reason why you end up with a heart attack. So those were the 2 major reasons why I decided that this thrombogenic theory cannot possibly be the final answer to this question of why we have heart attacks. Then I started to look into it. And here is where the issue of how we look into it and the questions we ask about these theories show us that the people who are doing these theorizing have no interest in actually finding the truth. Because the next question I asked, okay, if you're saying the thrombogenic theory says that everybody who has a heart attack has a blockage in that artery, then let's do autopsy studies of people who die of a heart attack and see how many of them had a blockage in that artery leading to that part of the heart that had the attack. That would be an obvious question. And in fact, it turns out in the 30s and 40s and 50s, when this thrombogenic theory was gaining steam, as well as the cholesterol myth. There were a number of studies that did just that. And again, these studies I reference in the book. And the interesting thing is the range of autopsy studies that found there was a blockage of any significance in the artery leading to that part of the heart was a low of 18%, and the highest that I remember was 78%. Meaning that somewhere between 82% and 82% is 18% had a blockage, to 22%, meaning 78% had a blockage, 22% didn't. So what happened to those 22 to 82%? Why did they have a heart attack? They didn't even have a blockage. Now, just because somebody had a blockage in that artery leading to that part of the heart, by no means proves that the blocked artery was the cause of the heart attack. And then I ended up reading a book by Giorgio Baroldi, and I can't remember the exact name of the book, but you could probably find it, called The Etopathogenesis of Heart Attacks or Coronary Disease or something like that. Giorgio Baroldi, an Italian pathologist who spent his entire career investigating and doing autopsies on people who died of heart attacks. And he came out with the definitive number, which is 41% of people who die of heart attacks. So these are the worst of the worst. They didn't just have a heart attack and survive. They had a heart attack and actually died from the heart attack. 41% of them had a blockage of any significance leading to that part of the heart, meaning 59% didn't. So what happened to them? And then he said that of those 41%, approximately half he could demonstrate that the blockage came after the heart attack, not before. So now we're down to 20% of the people, approximately, even have a blockage of any significance before the heart attack, and that means 80% didn't. And that still doesn't mean, it's still not a proof that the 20% who had a blockage, that blockage was the actual precipitating reason, cause for the heart attack. It may not have been. In fact, if you get results like that, anybody looking into this would say, I don't think we have the full story here. Because if 80% don't even have any significant blockage, then what in the heck is going on? And then the final thing is I ran across this video, this is more recently, which I think shows everything you need to know about the fallacy of this thrombogenic theory, and hopefully should answer all these questions so that nobody believes in this theory ever again. So let's take a look at this. So let me just stop for a minute before I play it. So this is a typical picture that cardiologists love to show their heart patients, and they usually will tell you this part here was blocked and this part here, these are the three main coronary arteries. And this is their depiction of the blood supply to your heart. As you can see, all of the blood goes through these three major arteries. The first thing I want to point out is this is not actually a real heart or a real photograph of the blood supply. Obviously, this is a drawing. Somebody was told to draw this, and as you'll see, it actually has no relation to the actual blood supply of the heart.
Film made during an angio. The right coronary artery at left hand will be filled with contrast medium using a heart catheter. Before we start the film.
So every time in all my years of practice since this came out, when a person with heart disease came to my office, I would show them this and say, this is my patient intelligence test. I would also point out that it took me 20 years to figure this out, so I'll give you 15 seconds. And the question was, so the dye is put in up here through the catheter. Here's the right coronary artery. Here's the blockage. So what, just knowing, all you know is this picture. How do you already know that this whole theory is basically a crock? So I'm going to stop there. I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about it, and then we'll go on. But all you know is this one picture. And already you should know something doesn't smell right here. So let's now run through the video and you'll see exactly what the problem is.
I want to show you the most important result of this examination in advance. You can see a severe narrowing, a stenosis, in the midsection of the artery. Now let us take a look at the angio. Let's watch the film again. I will now show you a series of photos taken from the angio so that you can study the procedure in detail. Here is the first photo. At the upper edge of the picture you see the heart catheter with its curved end still empty of contrast medium. Now the contrast medium starts to appear. You can see the roughly S-shaped form of the upper section of the artery, marked by contrast medium. This is the most intriguing photo. Why is this? The most important feature is the dark strip marked at the bottom left of the photo. This shows contrast medium in a section far beyond the stenosis. Nothing can yet be seen of the narrowing itself. Despite this, a section of the coronary artery far beyond the stenosis is already filling up. Here for the first time the stenosis, circled, appears. This is the same photo. The narrowing can be vaguely recognized due to the descending flow from above, but mainly as a result of the ascending flow from below. Things now become clearer. This stenosis hardly allows a single drop of blood to pass. The stenosis allows practically nothing to pass. It's not the case, as a layperson might assume, that the blood somehow manages to squeeze through the bottleneck and struggles to fill the lower part of the artery. Yet it is exactly this section beyond the narrowing that is well filled. The blood must come from somewhere.
Just to comment on that, so the blood must come from somewhere. This is proof that there is a wide network of blood flow called collateral vessels, small vessels, that is the vast majority, I don't know exactly the percentage, probably well over 90 to 95% of the blood flow comes through these other channels, these small vessels. And if you actually see a picture that is showing the actual blood in the heart, you see it looks like a watershed, not three rivers. And this picture is proof, as he says, the blood must come from somewhere. And so the angiograms, these heart catheter procedure, creates an artifact, meaning it doesn't show these small vessels, probably because of the dye or because of the pressure that they inject it, or maybe some other reason, and they pass that off that these vessels don't exist, and that is nonsense. This is proof that the vessels do exist, and that's where the blood flow comes from.
Even if the collaterals, the vessels that make a detour around the stenosis, are not clearly seen, these photos are proof of their existence and effectivity. This is a perfect illustration of a 90% stenosis. However, this method fails to provide decisive information. It's not possible to show the extensive network of collaterals using the heart catheter. This leads to considerable false interpretations regarding the importance of coronary artery stenosis. In the very small narrowing, a little blood forces its way from above and a little from below. The blood in the stenosis is stagnant. If the narrow passageway is closed completely by a blood clot, a thrombosis, what happens then? Does a heart attack occur, as generally assumed? By no means. The blood is already standing still in the stenosis. A complete closure would have no effect. There is no alteration whatsoever. There can be no better illustration. The blood supply to the heart muscle beyond the stenosis is completely unaffected. The right coronary artery is clearly and powerfully displayed far to the regions of its finest branches. The stenosis does not damage the heart. To familiarize yourself with these invisible collaterals, do take another look at this short film.
Okay, that should, I think, answer all the rest of the questions. The coronary angiogram produces an artifact by not showing the collateral vessels. The collateral vessels, they are the majority, the vast majority of the blood flow. And so the stenosis has no effect on the blood flow in most cases. And so this problem cannot be a problem of coronary artery stenosis, either by cholesterol, gremlins, LP(a), LDL, decreased HDL, or inflammation of the vessels. So that is not the problem. The problem, therefore, must be of the heart itself. And there must be some difference between the heart and the spleen and the leg and the artery and the liver and the kidneys and the pancreas. It's the heart versus these other organs, the heart and the brain. There's something different about the heart, has nothing to do with the blood vessels or the so-called plaque-forming components in the blood. And the final reason that one could come to this, that I came to this conclusion, is looking at the studies done to, quote, fix these stenosis, meaning bypasses and stents. And again, you can find the studies in my book, and these studies are well known, like the Courage study, which showed clearly there is no longevity benefit from doing bypasses and stents, even though if the thrombogenic theory was correct and you bypass that artery, it should make you live longer. It doesn't. It should make you have fewer heart attacks in the future. It doesn't. The only claim that they could make was people who have stents have, which is, by the way, approximately $50 billion industry per year, I'm told. The only positive benefit we say is people who have stents have less pain on exercise than people who don't. However, it turns out there was actually a study that tried to see if even this was correct. And here's the study. This was published here. Lancet.com, November 2nd, 2017. There's the DOI number, so you can look it up yourself. And as far as I know, this was the first time in history that they actually did a blinded study of stents. In other words, as you could see, they enrolled 230 patients. They underwent 200 underwent randomization. 105 got PCI, which is stent. 95 got the placebo procedure. In other words, they did an angiogram, told them they put a stent in, but didn't, took the catheter out and saw what happened. So they go through the details and they tell you the conclusion here, which is in patients with medically treated angina, chest pain, and severe coronary stenosis, that's blockage, stenting PCI did not increase exercise time by more than the effect of the placebo procedure. And then they say you can investigate invasive procedures using placebo controls. In other words, the third thing that they could tell people doesn't make you live longer, doesn't prevent further heart attacks, but you'll have less chest pain. Turns out you don't have less chest pain when for the first and only time they investigated this with a placebo. And here you can see another interpretation of those results. This was from some thing in India, same thing. The researchers said, conclusion, there is no evidence from blinded placebo-controlled randomized trial to show its PCI, that stenting efficacy in any way. So if you would expect that if the problem was blockages, that putting a stent in the blockage would do something, help you live longer, prevent further heart attacks, or at least, as we were telling people all these years, you would have less pain. It turns out it doesn't do any of those things for the simple and obvious reason that your body, because most of the blood supply comes from these collateral vessels, has already done a bypass, and so it can't possibly do you any good. So the question then we're left with is there some other way of looking at this that we can explain why people do have heart attacks? And the best information we have about this, and what I wrote about in the book and we have written about in many other places, is that there's basically three reasons. The first reason is we have an autonomic nervous system, which is divided into a sympathetic and parasympathetic chain. The sympathetic is the fight or flight. There's a lion chasing you and you have to run. Parasympathetic is life is good and rest and digest. Cardiologists are very aware that this system has a lot to do with the heart. It controls the heart rhythm and the rate and the caliber of the blood vessels to a certain extent. And they routinely ascribe heart disease to an overactive sympathetic activity, which is why they give you beta blockers, because the beta that they're blocking is part of the sympathetic nervous system. So in other words, the theory is too much sympathetic activity, i.e. too much stress, and you have a stressful life, etc. And so we're going to block it, and then you're going to have less pain and live longer. The reality is, and we know this from heart rate variability, that even though excess sympathetic activity and decreased parasympathetic tone are similar, they are not the same. And heart rate variability studies, which show that over something like 90% of people who have heart attacks have decreased parasympathetic tone in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the event. So in other words, all the things that degrade our parasympathetic nervous system, which means being out of shape and poor exercise and poor food and emotional stress and toxicity and fear, hatred, and lies in your personal life and in your cultural life. All these things impact negatively your parasympathetic activity, resulting in decreased parasympathetic tone. And that's what eventually leads to a dysfunction in the metabolism of your heart muscle. And that leads to chest pain and heart attacks. So that's reason number one, decreased parasympathetic tone. Reason number two is obviously you have a problem with the main blood supply to your heart, which is these collateral vessels, these small blood vessels. And this clears up another enigma, which I had wondered about for 30 or 40 years, which is why do diabetics get more heart disease, heart attacks than so-called normal people? Because as far as I know, there is no actual proven theory or proven evidence that diabetics get more plaque. But there is abundant evidence that diabetics have small vessel disease. In other words, they have inflammation and a sort of corrosive effect on their small vessels, which is why they have eye disease and kidney disease and peripheral neuropathy. It's all about the main blood flow to our body, our tissues, which is through these small collateral capillary system. And since that's over 90% of the blood flow to the heart, if you have deterioration of your capillary blood flow, you will have decreased blood flow to your heart and be more susceptible to have a metabolic, defect in your heart muscle. So that's reason number two. So reason number one is decreased parasympathetic tone. Reason number two is poor small blood vessels or small vessel disease. And number three, which is by far the most important because all heart attacks have to go through this process. And it goes something like this: because of decreased parasympathetic tone, because of small vessel disease, because of mitochondrial injury or disease or dysfunction. And this can happen because of EMF exposure, heavy metal exposure, antibiotics, vaccines, chronic stress. Lots of things interfere with mitochondrial function, which is the part of your tissues that generate the ATP, which, as I've said, helps structure the water and creates the energy. And the ATP is made through a process called oxidative phosphorylation. And so if all is well, you have a healthy parasympathetic tone, you have good collateral blood flow, you haven't taken vaccines and antibiotics and EMF exposure, and you've done earthing and good diet and all the rest, you will have healthy mitochondria and you will use oxidative phosphorylation, respiration, to generate ATP, which will structure your water to create the voltage, which is what we call life. All this will create an energy field that's shaped like a torus, emanating out widely from your heart, extending many, many feet, and maybe even to a certain extent indefinitely out from your heart, as this energy field created by this healthy metabolizing heart becomes the conductor, the center of all your tissues. It is the conductor of your orchestra called your body, yourself. Now, you could have a situation where, because of the things I just mentioned, you are not your mitochondria are diseased and don't function properly. And then in any kind of stressful situation, you will resort to the backup mechanism of generating ATP, which is called fermentation or glycolysis. And this is much less efficient on the order of 2 ATPs per sugar as opposed to around 36 in respiration. And the byproduct of fermentation is lactic acid. And it's the buildup of the lactic acid, which then acidifies your tissue. And the same thing happens in your leg and your spleen. So if it happens in your leg, you have a buildup of lactic acid in your leg tissue, and that causes pain and cramps in your leg. And your leg stops, you stop your leg from running, from moving because of the pain. If it happens in your spleen stops. If it happens in your liver, the metabolism of your liver stops. The only 2 organs that can't stop are your heart and your brain. And so what happens then, obviously, is this glycolysis continues, the lactic acid continues to build up, the tissue becomes acidic, not because you eat acidic food or acid food or because of your diet, except insofar as it helps generate healthy mitochondria or foster healthy mitochondria. This is entirely an energetic problem of a switch from normal respiration to fermentation. Interestingly, the same process that happens in cancer. And then you get the buildup of acids in the tissue, and you can demonstrate with animal studies, for instance, this was done by Manfred van Arden back in the 40s and 50s, that in every case of angina, there's a buildup of lactic acid causing the cramps and the pain. Your heart can't stop, so the lactic acid builds up. You get an acidification of the tissue, which causes then a necrosis or breakdown of the tissue, and that's what we call a heart attack. It's as simple and straightforward as that. Now, once an area of the heart is dead because of this necrosis, because of the acidification, the blood supply has a harder time getting through that area because it's dead. And so you get buildup of debris upstream from the blockage. Just like if you put a beaver dam in the river, you would get debris upstream from the beaver dam. This exactly explains why you see blockages after the heart attack and often not before. Just like Baroldi said, the blockages are a result of the buildup of debris because of the now defect in the muscle metabolism. That's also why, because if you go in there in the immediate sense and flush out the debris, you will get a partial restoration of the blood flow and a return temporarily to a more normal metabolism of the heart. But you haven't actually fixed anything because the blockage was not the problem. It was the consequence, not the cause of the heart attack in the first place. And just to finish, the reason this is so important is there is a medicine called strophanthus. Strophanthus is the seeds of the Strophanthus gratis plant. It grows like a perennial vine in Madagascar and other parts of Africa and the Cameroon. And this perennial vine, 200, 300 feet, makes pods, and it's loaded with seeds, and the seeds have an active ingredient called wabein. And when you use a strophanthus seed extract, so you have to use the entire seed, and you have to demonstrate, as we have done for our strophanthus seed extract and powder capsules, that it comes from the entire strophanthus seed, and it contains the chemical active ingredient wabein in the extract and in the powder. So what does wabein strophanthus seed extract do? 3 things. 1, it supports the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. It acts like what I used to call a neurotransmitter, but I now know that neurotransmitters don't exist. So it just has a supportive activity for the function of the parasympathetic nervous system. So that addresses problem number one. Secondly, it makes the red blood cells and platelets more flexible. And so that makes the blood flow through the small vessels easier and more fluid. And so it addresses problem number two, which is a stasis and a stagnation in the small vessels of the heart. And then most importantly, it converts this chemical, lactic acid, which is the central toxin in this drama. It is the part that acidifies the tissue. It is the part that ultimately destroys the tissue. And it converts lactic acid into a compound called pyruvate, which goes back into the respiratory cycle, into the oxidative phosphorylation cycle, thereby restoring the normal energy pathways, thereby stopping the buildup of acidity through the buildup of lactic acid, therefore decreasing or stopping the angina and decreasing or stopping the progression to heart attacks and increasing the metabolic activity, the energetics of the heart, so that your heart can generate this powerful toroidal electromagnetic field around your entire body, through which the other organs entrain and take their lead from this field that we call the heart. And it's this toroidal field of the heart which you sense when you sense the connection with another person. When we talk about a love, that's the emanation of your heart, this electromagnetic field, which comes from a robust metabolism of your heart. So if somebody asks me what damages the ability of the heart to create this powerful electromagnetic toroidal field around it, which is literally the center of our existence, there's lots of things. There's, as I said, heavy metals and vaccines and antibiotics, because the mitochondria are supposedly old bacteria. There's electromagnetic fields. There's not connection to the sun and to the earth and to plants and animals and cats and dogs and all the things that generate a healthy life, which generate a healthy electromagnetic field in your heart, which organizes, conducts all the organs into a coherent whole. But at the end of the day, if you want to know what really damages your heart, it's living a life based on three principles: fear, hatred, and lies. Anytime you engage in that, whether voluntarily or even because you didn't know better, then that damages your heart. It interferes with the metabolism of your heart, and you become more susceptible to heart attacks, and your whole field and your loving nature shrinks, and we end up with the world that we currently have. We can reverse that by renouncing fear, renouncing hatred, and living a life where we seek out the truth and we don't stand for lies, half-truths, or agree with misconceptions, and we do whatever we can to educate ourselves as to what the difference is. So hopefully that gives everybody a short understanding of my take on what is a heart attack, what it isn't, and then what it is. And I welcome any comments. And thanks everybody for listening, and I will see you next week.